The blade that severed my safety cable was not the storm, but the cold calculation of a senior director. At 38, I thought I had swallowed every drop of corporate betrayal. That was before I found myself trapped in a flooded canyon with a Marine major. Realizing the architect of my murder was the exact same woman smiling as she pinned a medal of dedication to my chest. Welcome to Maya Revenge Stories, where we bring you intense, true-to-life dramas. But unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our monetization, leaving us with absolutely zero budget to keep operating. If you find today's story compelling, please consider supporting our hardworking team with just $1 by scanning the PayPal QR code on the screen or clicking the link in the description or comments, so we can pay our staff's living expenses and keep creating for you. My name is Jimena Hoffman, and I am 38 years old. For over a decade, I built my career as a senior field operations analyst for the Federal Emergency Response Directorate, an agency where weakness is considered a contagious disease. I was once the woman they called when disaster struck, the one who walked into the wreckage of chemical spills and earthquake zones to map out survival grids. But everything changed after the tunnel collapse 4 years ago. I survived being buried alive for 36 hours, but the crushing weight of the concrete debris left me with a severely reconstructed left shoulder. I underwent 3 surgeries and months of agonizing physical therapy just to be able to lift a coffee cup, let alone carry a 30-pound tactical pack. To the higher-ups sitting in their climate-controlled offices, and to the fresh-faced cadets barely out of college, I had become damaged goods. They looked at me with a sickening mixture of pity and barely concealed disdain. They whispered in the break rooms that I should have taken a desk job, that my presence in the field was a liability waiting to happen. Their prejudice culminated in my assignment to Fort Vanguard. It was a brutal, mud-soaked tactical training facility clinging to the edge of a jagged cliffside in the deepest wilderness. The air there always smelled of damp earth and rotting pine, and the freezing rain never seemed to stop. It was a place designed to break the weak, and I knew exactly why the regional director had sent me here. They wanted me to fail, to quit on my own so they would not have to deal with the optics of firing a disabled veteran of the department. The turning point happened on a Tuesday morning during a high-angle rope traverse exercise. The objective was to cross a gaping, flood-swollen ravine. The rain was coming down in thick, gray sheets, stinging my face like icy needles and turning the ground into a treacherous slick of clay. I strapped myself into the harness, ignoring the dull, throbbing ache radiating from my collarbone. I was about halfway across the roaring gorge, suspended 80 feet in the air, my muscles screaming in protest against the freezing wind. Suddenly, a sickening sound of grinding metal echoed over the rush of the river below. My primary pulley jammed hard against the thick steel cable. Before I could even shout a warning, the main housing snapped violently. I went into a terrifying freefall. Gravity ripped me downward. I slammed into the sheer, jagged rock face of the cliff with bone-crushing force. The impact knocked the wind completely out of my lungs, sending a blinding, white-hot shockwave of absolute agony tearing through my previously shattered shoulder. I dangled helplessly over the raging, muddy water, spinning like a broken rag doll on a single, fraying nylon safety line, my vision blurred with hot tears of physical pain and overwhelming, suffocating humiliation. I could hear the panicked, high-pitched shouts of the young cadets on the ridge above me, but their voices sounded distorted, as if I were underwater. I closed my eyes, waiting for the final snap of the rope. Then, the main line shifted violently above me. A dark silhouette rappelled down the sheer vertical drop with terrifying speed and calculated precision. It was Marine Major Elias Thorne. He was the guest tactical instructor for the cycle, a man built like a stone wall, possessing calm, deeply exhausted eyes that spoke of years spent in hostile territories. He did not yell. He did not panic like the kids on the ridge. He simply dropped into the void, swinging his massive body weight perfectly to intercept my spinning form. His heavy combat boots planted firmly against the slick, wet rock face, and his thick, gloved hand seized the back of my tactical harness in midair. He halted my deadly descent with an iron grip that defied gravity. "I have got you," he grunted, his voice a steady rumble over the howling wind as he quickly slammed a heavy steel carabiner from his rig onto my D-ring. "Do not move an inch. Hoffman." Getting back up to the top of the ridge was a waking nightmare. My left arm hung entirely useless at my side, burning as if someone had injected boiling battery acid directly into the joint. Major Thorne practically carried my entire body weight. He hauled me up the steep, muddy forest path, his breathing steady and rhythmic, while I gasped and choked on the freezing rain. Every single step sent a fresh wave of torturous pain radiating from my neck down to my fingertips. But the physical agony paled in comparison to the psychological torment. When we finally breached the crest of the hill, the entire squad of young cadets was standing in a circle, staring. Their eyes were wide, taking in the pathetic sight of the veteran field analyst having to be hauled up the mud like a helpless, injured animal. My professional pride, a fortress I had spent over 15 years building with my blood and sweat, shattered into a million irreparable pieces under their judgmental gaze. We collapsed near a thick cluster of pine trees, far enough away from the prying eyes of the trainees. The freezing downpour plastered my hair to my face and neck. I was shivering violently, clutching my ruined shoulder, trying desperately to swallow the heavy, choking lump of utter humiliation lodged in my throat. I felt so small, so utterly defeated. I needed to say something, anything, to deflect the absolute misery of the moment and hide how close I was to sobbing. I forced a bitter, trembling smirk onto my blue lips. "Whoever marries you will be lucky," I blurted out, my voice raspy and pathetic, barely cutting through the relentless sound of the storm. Major Thorne was kneeling in the cold mud, meticulously checking the frayed end of my severed pulley line. At my words, his hands stopped moving. He did not laugh. He did not offer a polite, dismissive military chuckle. The massive Marine paused for a long, heavy heartbeat. He slowly turned his head, letting the freezing rain run down his scarred, hardened jawline, and looked straight into my completely broken eyes. His gaze was incredibly steady, piercing right through the thick armor of my bitter, self-deprecating joke. "I was hoping that someone would be you," he replied, his voice a warm, deep resonance that somehow silenced the howling storm around us. The interior of my assigned canvas tent was suffocating, smelling of wet wool and the metallic tang of my own adrenaline. I sat on the rigid military cot, a flickering, battery-operated lantern casting distorted shadows against the fabric walls. My left arm was bound tight against my chest in a makeshift sling, throbbing with a relentless rhythm. Spread across my knees were the remains of my fractured safety rig. I traced my uninjured thumb over the sheared edge of the main pulley housing. My breathing hitched. The metal had not just snapped under pressure. Right at the stress point, hidden perfectly beneath the nylon tracking line, were deep, deliberate gouges. Someone had taken a heavy-duty file to the reinforced alloy, compromising its structural integrity so that it would fail the moment it bore human body weight. This was no act of nature. This was attempted murder. The sound of the tent flap unzipping jolted me out of my horrifying realization. I quickly tossed a damp towel over the ruined gear, just as Regional Director Valerie Sterling stepped into the dim light. Valerie looked as if she had just left a corporate boardroom, completely untouched by the miserable field conditions. Her tailored waterproof coat was spotless, her blonde hair pulled back in a sleek twist, and her lips painted a shade of crimson. She was my direct superior, the woman who had personally overseen my transfer here. "Shimina, my dear," Valerie cooed, her voice dripping with a saccharine sweetness that made my stomach churn. She approached my cot, her eyes darting briefly to my sling. "I heard about the tumble. The medics tell me you took quite a severe hit. I am absolutely heartbroken for you." I forced my face into a mask of polite stoicism. "It was an equipment malfunction. Director Sterling, the housing gave out." Valerie sighed, a long theatrical exhale, and gently patted my uninjured knee. "Of course it was, dear, but we must be realistic. This environment is exceedingly demanding, and with your prior medical history, accidents are bound to happen when the body can no longer keep up. The agency is incredibly grateful for your service. Perhaps it is time we discuss a dignified transition, an early retirement package, fully funded. You could rest. It was a beautifully constructed threat, wrapped in velvet and laced with poison. She was offering me a way out, provided I went quietly and accepted the narrative of the broken veteran. I will keep that under advisement, Valerie, I replied, keeping my voice deadpan. She offered a thin, razor-sharp smile, then turned and glided out of the tent, leaving behind the cloying scent of expensive perfume. The true venom of her visit became apparent the moment I stepped out into the mess hall for evening rations. The silence that fell over the long wooden tables was deafening. The young cadets abruptly averted their gazes. I could hear the toxic whispers slithering through the humid air. They were saying I had staged the entire incident. The rumor mill was churning out the narrative Valerie had expertly planted. They whispered Ximena Hoffman was terrified of the upcoming combat endurance test, so she faked a malfunction to get a medical pass. The professional reputation I had bled for was being dismantled right in front of my eyes. I was an outcast in a camp where trust was the only currency that mattered. The psychological isolation was agonizing. I retreated to the darkest corner of the hall, staring blankly at a bowl of flavorless stew, feeling the weight of paranoia pressing down on my chest. A heavy ceramic mug suddenly slid across the scratched table. Coming to a halt next to my tray, steam spiraled up from the dark coffee. I looked up to see Major Elias Thorne sliding into the bench across from me. He did not say a word at first. He simply unbuttoned his soaked jacket, his presence a grounding anchor in the swirling sea of hostile whispers. Underneath his coat, he pulled out a crumpled, mud-stained piece of waterproof paper. "Drink," Elias commanded softly, his voice a low rumble. "You look like a walking corpse." I wrapped my trembling hand around the hot mug. "Thank you," I murmured. Elias slid the crumpled paper across the table, covering it with his massive hand until it was right in front of me. I did a sweep of the staging area after the medical team cleared out, found this caught in the brush right below the equipment lockbox. Someone was careless. I carefully pulled the document toward me. It was a shredded shipping manifest, partially dissolved by the storm, but the bold alphanumeric string printed at the top center was clear. It was a procurement batch code. My heart slammed violently against my ribs. I knew that specific string of numbers. My mind raced backward, tearing through archives of field reports. 2022. It was the government contract for the deployment of rescue equipment, and the executive in charge of authorizing that vendor was Regional Director Valerie Sterling. The pieces of the puzzle violently snapped together, forming a picture so terrifying I could barely draw breath. During a routine cross-referencing audit in the winter of 2022, I had stumbled upon a massive financial discrepancy in that exact procurement line. Millions of dollars had vanished into shell companies under the guise of paying for high-grade gear, while the agency received cheap knockoffs. I had drafted a preliminary report, but it was mysteriously buried, and my access to the financial database was quietly revoked. I looked up at Elias, my blood turning to absolute ice. The Federal Oversight Committee was scheduled to launch a massive audit exactly next month. If I was still alive, I would be legally obligated to testify under oath, and I would pull the thread that would unravel Valerie's entire empire of embezzlement. I was not sent to Fort Vanguard to fail a physical test. I was sent here to have a tragic, fatal accident. The failing pulley was just the beginning. The woman offering me fake sympathy had signed my death warrant, and now I was trapped in an isolated wilderness with a security detail loyal to the woman who wanted me dead. The sharp blast of the base camp siren shattered the brief illusion of rest. It was barely 2200 hours, but the public address system crackled to life, echoing through the freezing fog. The night navigation exercise, originally scheduled for Thursday, had been aggressively moved up. The orders were pinned to the command board, bearing the unmistakable, immaculate signature of the regional director. I stared at the tactical map. my stomach clenching into a tight knot. Out of 40 trainees and a dozen instructors, Valerie had specifically paired me with Major Thorne. Our designated grid coordinate was Sector 7, a narrow, winding depression known locally as the Devil's Throat. It was a steep canyon notorious for deadly flash floods, entirely unsuitable for a night operation, especially with my injured shoulder. But refusing the order meant immediate insubordination, playing right into her hands. We geared up in tense silence. The air was thick, heavy with the promise of violence. We marched out of the compound, the camp's floodlights quickly swallowed by the impenetrable, suffocating blackness of the wilderness. The descent into the valley was a treacherous crawl. The muddy incline gave way to jagged slate, slick with relentless drizzle. The temperature dropped drastically the deeper we went, the cold sinking its teeth right through our tactical layers. The air grew stagnant, smelling of decaying leaves and wet limestone. We reached the basin of the canyon, surrounded by towering walls of solid rock that blocked out any trace of moonlight. The silence down here was unnatural, broken only by the crunch of our boots against the loose gravel. I reached for my shoulder-mounted radio to call in our first checkpoint. I pressed the transmission button. Nothing but dead static hissed back at me. I tried the emergency frequency. Total silence. I looked over at Elias, who was aggressively tapping the screen of his military-grade global positioning system device. "Signal is gone," Elias growled, his voice tight with alarm. "Satellites are totally blacked out. This is not interference from the rock walls. The receiver is completely dead." A cold spike of pure terror drove itself into my spine. My radio and his tracking device failing at the exact same moment was impossible. We were completely digitally blind, severed from the rest of the world. We were entirely alone in the dark. Then, the ground began to vibrate. It was not a sound at first, but a deep, rhythmic trembling beneath the soles of my boots. A low, guttural roar echoed from the northern bend of the canyon, growing louder with every passing second. It sounded like a massive freight train tearing through the forest. "Water!" Elias shouted, his calm demeanor instantly shattering. "Move!" I spun around, aiming the beam of my tactical flashlight up the gorge. A wall of churning, black water was violently smashing its way around the bend, obliterating everything in its path. It was a churning soup of destruction, thick with uprooted pine trees, massive boulders, and suffocating mud. The stream level was rising at an unnatural, terrifying speed. This was not the result of the storm. The upstream floodgates of the Vanguard Dam had been manually opened, unleashed hours ahead of protocol. Someone had triggered a lethal flush, and we were standing right in the kill zone. "Up the wall," Elias commanded, grabbing my uninjured arm. Panic flooded my veins. Adrenaline masked the agonizing pain in my shoulder as we scrambled toward the canyon wall. The water hit our ankles, freezing and forceful, threatening to sweep our legs out from under us. We clawed at the wet, crumbling slate. My boots slipped on the mossy rock. The roaring current was at our knees now, pulling with the strength of a monster. Elias pushed me from below, his massive hands acting as a brutal, driving force. I found a narrow fissure in the rock, jamming my boots into the crack. The water level surged to our waists, dragging Elias down. He let out a deafening roar of sheer exertion, utilizing every ounce of his combat conditioning to heave himself upward, dragging me with him. My fingers bled as they scraped against the unforgiving stone. We climbed higher, the deafening roar of the flood consuming the world beneath us. Just as the crest of the monstrous wave slammed against the cliff face, Elias shoved me violently into a shallow, hidden cave opening about 30 feet above the gorge floor. We collapsed onto the hard stone, gasping for air, our lungs burning like fire while the lethal torrent raged mindlessly below. We lay in the suffocating darkness of the cavern, the deafening roar of the water vibrating through the solid stone. My entire body was shaking uncontrollably, soaked to the bone and freezing. Every breath tasted like mud and copper. Elias shifted beside me, pulling a small, chemical glow stick from his utility belt and snapping it. A weak, Eerie green light illuminated the claustrophobic space. His face was covered in a mix of dirt and blood from a deep gash above his eyebrow, but his eyes remained fiercely alert. "Let me see the shoulder," he ordered, his breathing heavy. He carefully unclasped the broken straps of my harness. I bit my lip hard to suppress a scream as he adjusted my arm. He needed clean bandages. I reached for my waterproof backup backpack, the one piece of gear I had packed myself before leaving the main compound. My fingers were numb. Fumbling with the heavy-duty zippers, I tore open the main compartment, shoving aside my emergency rations and thermal blankets. As my hands scraped against the reinforced bottom lining, my fingers brushed against something hard and distinctly metallic. It did not belong there. Frowning, I pulled my tactical knife from my belt and sliced open the thick nylon seam of the inner lining. I reached deep inside the secret compartment and pulled out a heavy vacuum-sealed bundle. The green light of the glow stick reflected off the sleek, silver casing. I stopped breathing. Sitting in my hands was a stack of high-capacity, military-grade encrypted hard drives. They bore the unmistakable red insignia of the agency's highest clearance level. These drives contained the entire classified database of our national emergency response protocols. My mind raced, slamming into the horrifying truth. The failing pulley on the cliff was meant to kill me. But Valerie Sterling was a woman who never relied on just one strategy. She always built redundancies into her operations. If the fall did not break my neck, and if I somehow survived the fabricated flood in the canyon, I would eventually be rescued. And when the extraction teams dragged me out of the mud, they would confiscate my gear. They would search this very backpack. "Look at this," I whispered, my voice trembling with a mixture of absolute dread and pure, unadulterated rage. I held the drives out toward Elias. He stared at the government property, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle twitched in his cheek. He instantly calculated the devastating implication. If I walked out of this valley alive, I would not be walking out as a victim or a hero. I would be caught red-handed with stolen, highly classified national security secrets hidden in my personal gear. I would be arrested on the spot for espionage and grand treason. The upcoming financial audit would instantly be derailed. My credibility utterly destroyed, and I would spend the rest of my life rotting in a federal penitentiary. It was a masterclass in bureaucratic assassination. She had weaponized the very system I dedicated my life to protecting. Valerie had not just planned my murder, she had designed the perfect, foolproof execution of my entire existence. We were sitting in a watery grave, holding the final nail for my coffin. The deafening roar of the flash flood outside the cave should have driven us mad with panic. Instead, the enclosed space became a war room. We sat cross-legged on the cold stone, the eerie green light casting sharp shadows over our exhausted faces. Panic was a luxury neither of us could afford. We methodically dissected the architecture of the frame-up, the sabotaged gear, the manipulated communication blackout, the sudden schedule change, and now, the stolen intelligence data. It was a perfectly sealed loop. "She controls the internal security detail," I stated, my voice devoid of emotion, reduced entirely to tactical analysis. "Which means the moment we step back into the compound, we are going to be detained. They will not wait for federal marshals. They will conduct an immediate field search under the guise of an emergency protocol. They will find the drives in my bag, and I will be in handcuffs before I can even request legal counsel." Elias leaned back against the damp cave wall, his eyes never leaving mine. There was not a single trace of doubt in his gaze. "I spent over 20 years in the Corps," he began, his tone low and even. "I have seen good men, honorable men, completely destroyed by officers who needed a convenient scapegoat to cover up their own operational failures. I know exactly what it looks like when someone is shoved against a wall with a gun to their head by the very people supposed to have their back. You do not have the eyes of a traitor, Ximena. You have the eyes of a survivor." His words bypassed the hardened exterior I had maintained for years. The sheer relief of being believed, of not having to fight to prove my innocence, broke something open inside me. I looked down at my ruined shoulder, the source of so much misery. My husband could not look at me after the tunnel collapse, I confessed, the words slipping out into the darkness. We had been married for 6 years, but when the surgery started, when the medical bills piled up, and I could no longer carry the weight of my own life, he packed his bags. He told me he signed up for a partner, not a patient. I learned very quickly that loyalty is highly conditional. Elias let out a slow, heavy breath. He reached out, his rough, mud-stained hand resting lightly on my uninjured arm. Loyalty is rare, he agreed. When I came back from my last deployment, there was nobody waiting at the terminal. I spent 15 years fighting for a country that moved on without me. I came home to an empty apartment, a box of medals, and a lot of silence. You learn to rely strictly on yourself, but right now, we have to rely on each other. I nodded, drawing strength from his quiet solidarity. I picked up the vacuum-sealed bundle of hard drives again, angling it closer to the fading green light. As I ran my fingernail along the thick plastic casing, I felt a tiny, unnatural bump near the seam. I peeled back a sliver of the adhesive label. A microscopic silver disc stared back at me. "It is an active radio frequency identifier," I hissed, my heart skipping a beat. "A tracking beacon. It is pinging a constant location signal. Valerie and her private security team are probably tracking this exact coordinate right now. They know we survived the flood. They are just waiting for the water to recede so they can come collect the bodies or make the arrest." A dark, predatory smile slowly spread across Elias's face. The exhaustion vanished from his posture, replaced by the lethal focus of a combat veteran preparing for an ambush. He reached deep into the interior pocket of his soaked tactical vest and pulled out a matte black pouch lined with thick metallic mesh. "A military-grade Faraday bag," Elias explained, holding it open. "It completely blocks all electromagnetic fields and tracking signals. Standard issue for secure extractions." I carefully dropped the bundle of drives into the pouch, and he sealed the heavy Velcro closure. In an instant, we vanished from Valerie's radar. If her tracking screen just went dark, I analyzed, my mind racing ahead. She will assume the drives were either destroyed by the water or we drowned and the bag sank into the mud. "Exactly," Elias confirmed. "She thinks she has won. She will be preparing a beautiful memorial speech for tomorrow morning, ready to declare you a tragic casualty who unfortunately made some terrible choices." We sat in the dark, the pieces of a daring counteroffensive snapping into place. We were not going to run, and we were not going to hide in the wilderness waiting for a rescue team that might be compromised. We were going to walk straight back into Fort Vanguard at first light. We would use her absolute arrogance against her. We needed a stage, a public forum where she could not silence us or sweep the evidence under the rug. Tomorrow morning, the camp would be gathered for the daily briefing. The entire regional leadership board would be present. We decided to play into her narrative perfectly, giving her the exact reaction she expected, right up until the decisive, undeniable revelation. We were going to give her the floor and let her incriminate herself in front of the entire directorate. The cornered were about to turn the tables. Dawn bled into the horizon like a fresh bruise, casting a pale gray light over the devastated landscape. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a freezing mist that clung to the pines. The trek back to the main compound took us exactly 3 grueling hours. We were covered in a thick crust of mud, our uniforms torn, and my left arm throbbed with a sickening, rhythmic agony. Yet, beneath the extreme physical exhaustion, my mind was terrifyingly sharp. We walked side by side, our boots crunching against the gravel road, stepping into the lion's den with our eyes wide open. We crossed the perimeter threshold at precisely 7:45 in the morning. The main training square was already packed. Over 200 cadets and a dozen senior instructors were assembled for the morning briefing. The moment our boots hit the asphalt, the atmosphere completely shifted. It was not a welcoming committee. 6 heavily armored officers from the internal security detail materialized from behind the barracks, moving in a practiced tactical formation. They intercepted us directly in the center of the massive courtyard, their hands resting menacingly on the grips of their holstered sidearms. The entire camp fell into a deathly, suffocating silence. High above the sea of confused faces, standing on the elevated steel command podium, was Regional Director Valerie Sterling. She looked immaculate, dressed in a pristine charcoal suit that starkly contrasted with the grim, muddy reality of the camp. She held a sleek silver microphone in one hand and a digital tracking monitor in the other. Her face was set in a mask of perfectly manufactured sorrow, but from where I stood, I could see the triumphant, venomous glint in her eyes. "Detain them!" Valerie's voice boomed over the public address system, echoing off the surrounding concrete walls, particularly Agent Hoffman. Two guards stepped forward, violently grabbing my uninjured shoulder and yanking me forward. I did not resist. I let them mold me into the perfect picture of a captured fugitive. "Kimina Hoffman," Valerie projected, her voice dripping with theatrical disappointment. "Last night, during the emergency communication blackout, our cybersecurity grid detected a massive data breach. Highly classified operational files were illegally downloaded onto external physical drives. Shortly after, a secure radio frequency beacon attached to that exact hardware pinged its location. It traced directly to your grid sector, moving precisely with your designated coordinates before the signal was deliberately jammed." The crowd erupted into a chaotic wave of hostile whispers. The young cadets, the ones who had watched me dangle helplessly from the cliff just 24 hours ago, were now pointing fingers. I could see the raw contempt in the eyes of my peers. To them, the narrative made absolute, horrifying sense. I was the bitter, broken veteran who had staged a catastrophic injury as a distraction to execute a treasonous cyber heist. The judgment in the air was thick enough to choke on. "We have a strict zero-tolerance policy for treason," Valerie continued, stepping right to the edge of the podium, basking in her ultimate victory. "Search her pack. Empty every single compartment." A burly security officer ripped my waterlogged tactical backpack from my shoulder. He tossed it onto a metal inspection table dragged into the middle of the square. Hundreds of pairs of eyes were glued to that table. The tension was so incredibly tight it felt as though the very air might shatter. Elias stood totally still next to me, his expression carved from stone, watching the spectacle unfold with cold calculation. I maintained a strangely serene composure. I looked directly up at Valerie, refusing to break eye contact as the guard unzipped the main compartment. The loud, tearing sound of the heavy-duty zipper seemed to echo endlessly across the silent yard. The guard reached his gloved hand inside. He aggressively pulled out my wet thermal blanket, my emergency rations, and a tangled mess of climbing rope, throwing them unceremoniously onto the asphalt. He dug deeper. His hand paused. He felt a heavy, dense bundle wrapped tightly in a yellow waterproof poncho. Valerie leaned forward over the railing, her breath catching in her throat. She was waiting for the final curtain to fall. She was waiting for the silver casing of the hard drives to catch the morning sun. The officer hauled the heavy yellow bundle out of the bag and slammed it onto the metal table. He untied the thick nylon cord binding it together and aggressively peeled back the layers of the poncho. There was no silver casing. There were no classified hard drives. Resting in the center of the wet yellow fabric were 6 perfectly round, smooth gray river stones. A profound, absolute silence descended upon the courtyard. The wind itself seemed to stop blowing. The security officer frowned in deep confusion, picking up one of the heavy rocks and turning it over in his gloved hand as if he expected it to magically transform into a piece of technology. He looked up at Valerie and shook his head firmly. The mask of immaculate control on Valerie Sterling's face violently shattered, the color completely drained from her cheeks, replaced by a blotchy, frantic red. Her composure disintegrated in a fraction of a second. She gripped the railing of the podium so hard, her knuckles turned stark white. "No!" Valerie hissed into the microphone, the sound sharp and desperate. She dropped the tracking tablet, the expensive device clattering noisily onto the steel floor. She pointed a trembling finger directly at the metal table, her voice escalating into a shrill, hysterical scream. "That is impossible. They have to be in there. Look under the false lining at the bottom. The drives were put securely under the seam of the internal lining." The echo of her own words violently slapped against the concrete walls of the barracks. The hostile whispers of the crowd instantly died. The sheer implication of what she had just screamed hung suspended in the freezing morning air. Nobody but the owner of the bag, or the exact person who had illicitly tampered with it, could possibly know about a hidden, false seam at the bottom of the internal lining. Valerie froze mid-breath. Her chest heaved wildly as her wide, panicked eyes darted across the sea of suddenly suspicious faces. She realized, in that one agonizing heartbeat, that she had just confessed her crime to the entire camp. I took a deliberate, measured step away from the metal inspection table. The sound of my heavy boot striking the asphalt was the only noise in the completely paralyzed courtyard. I looked up at the elevated podium, fixing my gaze on the woman who had orchestrated my near-death experience. "I have a very simple question," I stated, my voice ringing out with crystal clarity, completely devoid of the panic she had so eagerly anticipated. "How exactly does a regional director, sitting comfortably in an executive office hundreds of miles away, know the intricate, customized structural details of the false lining inside my personal, off-market backup bag?" Valerie opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked like a fish gasping for air on dry land. The carefully constructed facade of her immaculate authority was melting away right in front of us, leaving only the terrified core of a cornered criminal. Before she could string together a coherent lie, the heavy steel gates at the main entrance of the compound screeched open. 3 unmarked black tactical vehicles rolled aggressively into the training square, their tires grinding loudly against the gravel. The camp security officers immediately stepped back in shock, their hands dropping away from their weapons as heavily armed federal agents poured out of the vehicles. They were wearing tactical vests emblazoned with the Department of Justice insignia. Elias did not even blink at the sudden arrival. He calmly turned around and walked over to his heavily modified military transport truck parked near the barracks. He popped the reinforced trunk, reached inside, and pulled out the matte black Faraday pouch. He walked straight toward the lead federal agent, a stern-looking man who clearly already knew the major, and handed over the sealed bag. "Major Thorne," the agent acknowledged with a sharp nod. "We intercepted your encrypted transmission at 0300 hours. Are these the assets?" "Intact and secured," Elias replied, his deep voice projecting easily across the quiet yard. He turned his gaze toward the podium, staring right through Valerie. "When you ordered the communication blackout last night, you forgot that Marine reconnaissance units do not rely on standard civilian cell towers. I used a military encrypted channel to contact federal oversight, and while we were sitting in the dark waiting out your manufactured flood, I utilized my field gear to perform a reverse extraction on your stolen drives." Elias paused, letting the heavy weight of his words sink in. He pointed a steady finger directly at the terrified executive. "You thought you wiped the camp's local server, but you were sloppy. The external drives you provided your team had an automatic backup protocol. I recovered the deleted security footage from the staging area. We have high-definition video of your personal executive assistant sneaking into the equipment lockbox and physically shoving those exact drives into the false lining of Agent Hoffman's bag, right after he took a heavy-duty file to her climbing rig." The silence was absolute. The final puzzle piece snapped into place, and every single cadet, instructor, and security guard in the yard suddenly understood the horrifying reality of what had actually transpired. 2 federal agents marched briskly up the metal stairs of the podium. Valerie Sterling did not fight back. She simply sagged, the arrogance completely drained from her posture. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs snapping tightly around her wrists echoed loudly over the public address system she had foolishly left turned on. She was escorted down the stairs and shoved into the back of a black vehicle in utter humiliation. Her sprawling empire of corruption and embezzlement was dismantled in less than 10 minutes. Life has a funny way of shifting gears. 6 months later, The freezing mud of Fort Vanguard felt like a lifetime ago. I was standing in the brutally bright, fluorescent lit parking lot of a suburban supermarket. As the newly appointed head of safety inspection for the entire directorate, I spent my days hunting down the logistical rot Valerie had left behind. But right now, my biggest conflict was staring at the grocery bags loaded in the trunk of my car. I am just saying, I grumbled, crossing my arms over my fully healed shoulder. There are exactly 42 different types of cereal in that store, Elias, and you somehow manage to consistently pick the one brand that tastes exactly like damp cardboard. Elias, dressed casually in a faded gray shirt and jeans, simply chuckled. He closed the trunk and leaned against the car, the warm afternoon sun catching the silver at his temples. He did not offer any poetic defense of his terrible grocery choices. He did not need to. He reached out, his massive calloused hand wrapping warmly around mine. His grip was firm, grounding, and incredibly safe. There were no dramatic vows or cinematic declarations of eternal love. We were simply two scarred survivors who had waded through the absolute worst of human nature and come out the other side together. I squeezed his hand back, leaning into his solid shoulder as we walked toward the driver's side. It was quiet, it was mundane, and it was absolutely perfect. Thank you so very much for listening to this story on Maya Revenge Stories. We truly hope you enjoyed it. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from today. If you found today's drama compelling, please consider supporting our channel with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen, or by clicking the link provided in the description or the pinned comment. YouTube has completely disabled our monetization, and your support is the only way we can pay our hardworking staff, help them feed their families, and keep creating more incredible stories for you. Thank you again, and we will see you in the next one.